Likuti Sichos, Chelik Chavtes, volume 29, the first Sicha for Parshas Re'eh. This Sicha will explain the reason for the various levels in the structure of the Beit Hamikdash on the Harabais and Temple Mount, and also how the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, was totally and absolutely disproportionally greater than all of them, yet it stood on the same level, and how this all relates to the individual person. As a quick introduction, in order to better familiarize ourselves with some of the concepts that will be mentioned in the Sicha, so we know that the monumental work of the Rambam, the Sefer Mishnah Torah, or Yad HaChazaka of the Rambam himself wrote it, and he wrote it with absolute precision. And every single word, every single expression tells us something, and has a significant insight and impact on the halacha that the Rambam is presenting. Also, on that note, the Rambam himself, as he says in the introduction to the Rambam, to this work, he says that everything here is exclusively halachis. That means whatever is mentioned in this book is all pertaining to actual law, not information, not history, and so on and so forth. Another thing to be familiar with, the four categories in the world, and that is Doimem, Tzemeach, Chayim, Medaber. Starting from the bottom, Doimem, the inanimate, Tzemeach is plant life, all kinds of plants, growth, and so on. Chai is the animal kingdom, that's animal life, and then the Medaber, which is the human being. And that brings us to the idea of Seder Hishtalshelus, the order of evolvement, how things evolve from one thing to another, as we see in the world. Once Hashem has contracted His greatness, the essence of godliness, the emanation that comes down into the world goes through a process of evolution, so to speak, where it goes from one higher level to a lower, to a lower, to a lower. It gets contracted, it gets filtered until it comes down to this physical world. And then the concept of Dira B'Tachtonim. The Medrash tells us that Hashem had a desire, and this is the reason why He created the world, that ultimately you should have the presence of Hashem, the essence of Hashem, Dira B'Tachtonim, dwelling down here in the very lowest point of the world. And finally, the last concept is the idea of Nimna Ham Nimnois, the impossible of impossibilities. Or, as the Gemara tells us, Hamokim Ha'orein Eino Min Hamida. Literally translated, the place, the space of the Orein, of the ark, was not actually in the measurement. What does that mean? That even though the ark of the covenant, did take up space because it had to conform to a certain dimension, criteria as the Torah prescribes, yet if one were to measure as it stood in the Kodesh HaKadoshim, in the Holy of Holies, as one was to measure from the wall to the ark, and then from the other side of the ark to the other wall, it would measure as if it wasn't there. In other words, it was existence or presence and the lack thereof, or the finite and infinite as it became fused together. Let's go into the Sicha itself. So in the laws of the building of the Beit Hamikdash, the Rambam says as follows: Hamikdash Kulei, the entire Beit Hamikdash, was not on one flat level, but rather it was on the incline of the mountain. And then he starts to describe in detail. He says, quote, and notice, pay attention to these words: when a person, kisha'adam nichnas mishar mizrachi, if a person should enter from the eastern gate of the Temple Mount, he would go until the end of the chel. That means he would walk on one level, on the same ground level. Then he would ascend from the chel to the what's called the women's courtyard, the women's gallery, 12 steps. Then he says he would walk straight on the same one level, continuously until he goes to the next landing of stairs, which is from the Ezras Nashim to the Ezras Yisrael, to the courtyard of the Israelites, which is the beginning of the Hazara, which is the main courtyard, and that was 15 steps. And then he says you would walk the whole Ezras Yisrael, that whole section, and then go up from there to the next level, which is called the Ezras HaKohanim. This is the courtyard which was primarily restricted to Kohanim only. At times, the Israelites can walk in there, but it's only if they had a purpose there. Otherwise, it was for Kohanim. And this was with one great step consisting of an Amma. And then he says over there was a Duchan, there was a platform that had 3 steps in it. And from there, he says, you go up to the Ulam, which is the main entrance hall. And that was on 12 steps. And the Ulam, he says, and the Heichal, which is the main temple hall, right? The one you see protruding in every depiction of the temple, that all was on the same flat level. Now the question is, why does the Rambam begin this description of the fact that the Beit Hamikdash was on an incline and there were levels higher than the other? Why does he begin it why does he begin this by in a negative expression? He doesn't say the Beit Hamikdash was all on various levels, but rather he says the Beit Hamikdash was not all on one level. Why doesn't he begin just in a positive note? The answer is because according to the Rambam, we know that fundamentally the Beit Hamikdash, in other words, the obligation, this mitzvah of building the Beit Hamikdash is actually a derivative, and perhaps you could say a continuation of the original mitzvah that they were commanded while in the desert, namely to construct the Mishkan. And therefore, one would think that just as in the Mishkan, the tabernacle, everything was one and the same level, right? It was all on a flat level. So too, this is how it would have to be in the Beit Hamikdash. And therefore, the Rambam comes to exclude this. And the Rambam comes to negate this and say, no, even though the Beit Hamikdash is a continuation of that, but in this aspect, the Beit Hamikdash was not like the Mishkan. However, what's really important over here is to focus on the fact that we know, as we said in the introduction, the Rambam is a Sefer Halachos. This book, this work of the Rambam is exclusively to teach us law. What is this idea that the Rambam writes that it wasn't all on a flat level and it was on varying escalations, varying ascents of levels, higher and higher? I mean, yes, it happens to be so, but what is the value of it, of us knowing it in the context of halacha? And therefore, this leads us to conclude that this is an essential, part of the essential idea of the Beit Hamikdash. In other words, it's part and parcel of building of the Beit Hamikdash. The idea of building a Beit Hamikdash, one has to know that within this idea of building Beit Hamikdash, there is this idea of going higher and higher and higher. What exactly is this all about? So the answer is, let's take a look at the Beit Hamikdash versus the Mishkan. We know that in the Mishkan, and likewise in the Beit Hamikdash, there were varying levels of Kedusha. There were varying levels of holiness. You had the courtyard, then you had the actual Mishkan, then you had the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, which obviously one level was higher than the other. However, in the Mishkan, it was all on one flat surface, whereas in the Beit Hamikdash, there had to be aliyos, there had to be ascents, and it went higher and higher, and the incline of the mountain. Why? Because the Mishkan was only a temporary structure. It didn't have the permanence. It didn't have a permanent effect on the place and where it stood. In fact, once the Mishkan was dismantled, that spot on which it just stood and was just holy had absolutely no value in terms of holiness. Maybe historically, but in terms of holiness, even if one should find a spot on which one stood, the Mishkan, there's absolutely no holiness to it. Why? Because the holiness only affected and permeated only the structure of the Mishkan itself. When it stood, the structure of the Mishkan itself, that called for holiness, because those were the walls, those were the items that were actually anointed in the holy oil. And therefore the whole Mishkan was on the same level. because it's not the place that became holy, it's not the space on which it stood that became holy, but rather the Mishkan itself is what brought the holiness as it stood there. And therefore there was no need for various levels. However, the Beit Hamikdash affected the space itself. The space where the Beit Hamikdash stood is holy, was made holy, and is still holy. An example for this is that the Rambam writes in the laws of offering karbanis that even though the, quote, the structure is not built, that means even though there's no Beit Hamikdash as we know it, yet, technically speaking, you're allowed to offer the offerings and you're allowed to consume, you're allowed to eat the kachim in the entire Azara. That means if one should know exactly where that space was, and be able, and if one should have the ability to determine where the exact spot of the Mizbeach was and build a Mizbeach, then you can technically offer the karbanos even though there's no Beit Hamikdash. So it's not contingent on the walls of the Beit Hamikdash, on the structure, rather the space itself became holy. And therefore, since the space itself was affected and permanently permeated with the Kedusha, so it's obvious that there are different levels, and therefore that became expressed in the incline going higher and higher, the ascending on the ascent on the incline of the mountain, as the Rambam describes, because this is inherent in the idea of the Beit Hamikdash, that it left a permanent mark of holiness on the space itself. And this gets reflected in the various steps, whether it's 12 steps, whether it's 15 steps, whether it's one major step, and so on and so forth. So now we understand the difference between the Beit Hamikdash and the Mishkan, and why the Beit Hamikdash had to be on an incline and continuously ascend higher and higher. However, this raises a very intriguing question. If that's the case, then how come the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, which is of course and obviously disproportionately greater in terms of holiness versus all the other parts of the Beit Hamikdash, and for example, that's why you can only walk in only once a year on a special day, and only the most special person, and only for the most special avodah, and so on and so forth. And the question is, following the above explanation, it would make sense, or so it would seem, that the Kodesh HaKadoshim should be in a much higher level. And yet we find that the Kodesh HaKadoshim, the Holy of Holies, was on the same level of the rest of the Heichal, the rest of what we call the Kodesh, the Holies. Why is it so? So the Rebbe says to understand this, we'll take a closer look, or get a bit deeper understanding, appreciation, in what we explained above. What we explained in the contrast of the Mishkan versus the Beit Hamikdash. You see, the Mishkan, what was its main point? Its main point was not so much to effect an essential transformation of the place on which it stood, rather to reflect, to kind of mimic the effect of Seder Hishtalshelus, of the order of evolvement of how godliness comes onto the world, and bring godliness into the world. So to speak, it was like a container in which you can contain godliness. When you went into it, you felt it in a very realistic, very vivid manner. And therefore, we can see this expression of this, as it was meant to mimic the order of Hishtalshelus, that we see it in the structure of the Mishkan itself. On the very bottom, it stood on the inanimate. And what were the sockets that held up the walls made of? Well, they were made out of silver. Well, silver comes from the ground. That is doimen. On top of that stood the walls of the Mishkan. What were the walls? What were the panels made out of? Wood, which comes from plants. It's trees. It grows. And on top of that, the covering itself was from chai, from animal skin, and so on. So you see the expression there. However, because the Mishkan was not there to bring down the Shekhinah in an actual manner, therefore, it was all on the same level. Because like we said, it did not affect one spot. In other words, one spot of the Mishkan wasn't holier than the other. One place wasn't greater than the other, because it was just there to reflect the idea of how the Shekhinah evolves and comes down to the world. But it didn't actually make the place, so to speak, absorb, become permeated with the presence of the Shekhinah. However, the Beit Hamikdash, as we explained, the whole idea of the Beit Hamikdash was that through it, Hashem affected and made realistic this idea of Dira B'Tachtoinim. What is Dira B'Tachtoinim? That Kedusha itself, the holiest in itself, the greatest level, the highest level, the essence of Hashem, becomes permeated into the world, into the entire world, into the very lowest level. Where does this get expressed the most? In the doimim, in the inanimate. And that's why the walls of the Beit Hamikdash, the whole entire structure was made out of stone, of inanimate. And this became expressed in the fact that the Beit Hamikdash was on an incline of the mountain, and the holier something is, in other words, the more Kedusha, the more holiness that it had, more presence of God that had permeated in it, the higher it was in a physical sense. So that to reflect what level it was on in terms of, within the Beit Hamikdash, in terms of how much absorption, how much presence of Kedusha there is in there. Because the place itself became transformed. And therefore there was different levels. Now we'll understand why the Kodesh HaKadoshim was not on a higher level. Because all the other levels of the Beit Hamikdash, all were, so to speak, proportionately higher to one another. In other words, yes, there was a higher level of Kedusha, but it was higher than the level prior to it. So there was some kind of relation, there was some kind of proportion. However, and therefore this became expressed in the amount of steps between one level and another. Right? Because the Shekhinah, what is the Shekhinah? Shekhinah is something which is already contracted, and it comes down and it permeates. It's Shekhinah. Shekhinah means that it dwells in a certain area. And that's what happened in the Beit Hamikdash. So some had a process of greater contraction that it went through, so there was less Shekhinah, versus the higher levels where there was more Shekhinah. So it was reflected in being higher and the various steps and so on and so forth. But the Kodesh HaKadoshim is actually a Hamshacha. It draws down the essence of godliness, which is absolutely disproportionate to anything and to everything. And therefore, and where do we see this? This became expressed, as we said in the introduction, as the Chazal tell us, Makim ha'arein eina min amida. That there was the impossibilities, that the Arein did not take up any space, the ark didn't take up any space. In the one hand, it was a finite existence, it had a measurement, it had a certain defined size, and yet it didn't take up any space. Because the Shekhinah, the presence of godliness that was there, was totally disproportionate to all the other areas of the Beit Hamikdash. As we would say, totally beyond L'mayla min hamakim v'zman. L'mayla min zman ben makim. Beyond any constraints, any finite parameters of time and space. And therefore, it was not possible for this to be expressed in a certain height. There's no height that can express this idea because it's totally disproportionate. The Kedusha that was in the Kodesh HaKadoshim to any other part of the Beit Hamikdash. So it's beyond any whatsoever height. It cannot be measured in any whatsoever way, not even replicated or mimicked in any other way. And therefore it didn't make a difference on which level the Kodesh HaKadoshim stood. Now, when we go back to the Rambam, if you remember, we said that everything he wrote was very, very precise, and every word is telling. We can see how this is expressed in the Rambam itself. The Rambam doesn't say, hey, there were various levels in the Beit Hamikdash. One higher than the other, and there's 12 steps between this and the other, 15 between the next one and the one on top of it. No. The way he says it is, quote, follow closely. Kisha Adam, when a person walks in from the Shara Mizrachi, from the eastern gate, and then he says Mahalech, he goes, and then he says Va'oila, and he ascends, and then he goes, and then he ascends, and he goes higher and higher. In other words, the emphasis here is the person going and his ascents. This is only possible this is only applicable in something that is proportionate to a person, that within the realm that a person can achieve, even though it's Kedusha, but it has some kind of finite touch to it. And therefore, you can say one is higher than the other. You're going straight, you're ascending. It's all about the person and his capabilities, albeit his spiritual capabilities and achievements, but still his capabilities. In other words, the person himself exists, and he's going higher, and he's ascending, and therefore gets expressed in the height and the amount of stairs that are there in the Beit Hamikdash. But the Kodesh HaKadoshim is totally disproportionate to the person, and the person himself becomes totally batal and mevutal. He's totally null and void, so to speak. In other words, it's not in his reach at all, beyond any whatsoever possibility. And therefore, it doesn't get expressed by how high it is or how low it is. That's not an expression that can really bring out the point, the essence of the Kodesh HaKadoshim. Now we know that everything that there is in the Beit Hamikdash is also in every individual, in each person. In fact, we say each person is like a miniature Beit Hamikdash. Where is this aspect in the person, in the existence of every single Yid? This idea of the Kodesh HaKadoshim, that it's beyond anything and everything else that's there, beyond any measure, beyond any ability to ascend or descend, it's totally in a different realm. We see this in the person, this gets expressed in the person in his Kodesh HaKadoshim. That is the level of the neshama, the yechida of the soul. That this is the same and equal in every single Yid. Even a Jew who outwardly doesn't even seem to be Jewish. Even a Jew who outwardly doesn't seem to have any whatsoever virtues. But the fact is that the Yechidah, the Kodesh HaKadoshim, does not get measured, does not get expressed by any whatsoever avodah, by any whatsoever level, by any whatsoever achievement or lack thereof. And therefore, in every single Yid, you have this Kodesh HaKadoshim, which is beyond any measurement whatsoever.